I have been laughed at in better dresses than the one I was wearing that night, by crueler people than the bride's cousins, and I had a strategy for it long before I ever set foot in that ballroom. Keep your hands moving. Grief, embarrassment, heartbreak, none of it survives contact with a piping bag that still needs filling. So when the laughter started, rolling down the long table like a spilled drink no one would mop up, I did not look up from the dessert I was plating. I had built worse things than a wedding cake out of worse nights than this one. What I did not expect was the silence that followed it. The particular, total silence of a room realizing, all at once, that the most dangerous man in Madrid had just stood up from his chair at the head table. Not for the bride. Not for a toast, and was walking the length of that ballroom toward me, past every person who just laughed. I did not know, yet, what kind of man stops a wedding to defend a stranger's dessert table. I was about to find out exactly what it would cost both of us. The Hidalgo Vasquez wedding was the largest cake I had ever built alone, and I had built it the way I built everything. 3 days of no sleep, sugar burns up both forearms, and a 6-year orange blossom confection that I had personally carried, layer by layer, into a ballroom that smelled like money and orchids. I run a one-woman pastry business out of a kitchen, the size of a closet in Lavapiés. And jobs like this one, the kind with a budget that made my accountant cry with relief, did not come often enough to turn down, no matter what they cost me to take. This one cost more than most. Weddings always did, since the one I stopped letting myself think about. I was at the dessert station, near the head table, finishing the final plating of individual tartlets, while the band played something slow, and the champagne did what champagne does to people who already think they're untouchable. When I heard my name pass between two of the bride's cousins like a joke, they'd been saving all night. That's the baker, the big one. A woman in green, loud enough to be heard, not loud enough to pretend she meant to be. God, imagine eating a 6-tier cake built by someone who looks like she's already eaten 5 of them. The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough. Enough that the sound rolled, the way laughter does at weddings, gathering strangers into its current whether they meant to laugh or not. I did not look up. I want to be precise about that, because I think people imagine there's a trick to it, some inner steel I was born with. There is. I simply finished piping the last rosette of cream onto the tartlet in front of me, the way I had finished 1,000 small tasks through 1,000 worse nights, because the alternative, looking up, letting them see it land, cost more than I was willing to spend on people who would forget my name by morning. My hands didn't shake. That was the only victory I was after. It was the silence after the laughter that made me finally look up. A chair had scraped back at the head table, not the bride's, not the groom's, and a man was standing, dark suit, dark eyes. A stillness to him that the rest of the room seemed to organize itself around without anyone telling it to. I didn't know his name yet. I would learn it within the hour, the way you learn the name of weather that's about to change your plans for the week. He didn't address the woman in green. He didn't raise his voice at all. He simply crossed the ballroom, unhurried, the kind of unhurried that makes a room hold its breath, until he was standing at my dessert table. Close enough that I could smell something sharp and clean underneath the cigar smoke clinging to his jacket. He picked up one of my tartlets, looked at it the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to trust. Ate it in one bite, standing in front of half the wedding, while the woman in green's face went the color of the tablecloth. "This is the best thing anyone has served at this wedding," he said, not loudly, but in a voice that carried anyway, the way certain voices simply do. Then he looked at me directly for the first time, a long, assessing look, nothing soft in it yet, and added, "Dulce. Whoever taught that woman manners should refund her family's tuition." The room laughed again, different laughter this time, laughter aimed somewhere else. "I don't need defending," I said, because it was true, and because something about the way he'd said dulce, sweet, but with an edge folded into it. Like he was testing whether the word fit me, or was simply a leash he was deciding to put on me, made me want to correct him before he got the wrong idea about what had just happened. "No," he agreed, setting down the empty tartlet wrapper with a precision that suggested he did nothing without precision. "You didn't flinch once." I watched the whole thing. Something moved behind his eyes, brief, gone before I could read it fully. That's rarer at these things than you'd think. He walked back to his seat without another word. And the head table absorbed him back into its hierarchy like nothing at all had happened. Except that every single person in that ballroom now knew my face, and knew, more importantly, that I belonged to no one's mockery for the rest of the night. I did not know, yet, that the man who had just eaten my tartlet in front of 200 strangers was Rafael Mendoza Solis, and that very few people in Madrid got to watch him cross a room for anyone. For any reason, without paying for the privilege of having witnessed it. I would learn that part by morning. By then, it would already be too late to walk away clean. My best friend Marisol found out about the gala through 3 separate group chats before I'd even gotten home, which told me everything about how fast that kind of story travels through a city that pretends not to care about gossip. "You're telling me," she said, sitting on my kitchen counter the next morning while I scraped sugar burns off my forearms and pretended my hands weren't still slightly unsteady from the adrenaline. "That Rafael Mendoza stood up. In front of everyone, for you, he ate a tartlet. That's the whole story. That is not the whole story, Alina, and you know it." She stole a piece of candied orange peel from my prep tray. The way she'd been stealing food from my kitchens since we were 19 and broke, and sharing a single oven between 2 apartments. "Do you know who that man is?" I didn't, not really, not beyond the way the ballroom had gone quiet around him. The way 200 wealthy strangers had organized their attention toward him like iron filings, toward something magnetic and possibly dangerous. I told her so. He runs half the ports on this coast. People who cross him don't get invited to weddings anymore. They don't get invited to anything. Marisol said it lightly, the way she said most frightening things, because that was how she'd learned to survive a childhood neither of us talked about much. And he stood up for a baker he'd never met because some idiot in green made a joke about her size. It wasn't about gallantry. He probably just doesn't like noise at his dinner. Sure. That's probably it. She didn't believe it any more than I did. This kitchen, small, ordinary mine, had been the only thing I'd built entirely on my own terms since I was 23. After the engagement that ended 3 weeks before the wedding, I'd already half-planned myself, down to the cake. I didn't talk about that one. Not to clients, not really to Marisol, not to anyone who hadn't already lived through it alongside me. I stopped taking the big wedding jobs for almost 2 years after mine fell apart, I said, half to Marisol, half to the tray of candied peel. Not really thinking about who else might hear a story like that someday. Not knowing yet that the man from the gala carried a wound shaped almost exactly like the words I was saying out loud. Watching other people build the thing I never got to have, it got easier eventually. The Hidalgo Vasquez cake was the biggest one I'd said yes to in years, and now the city's most dangerous man knows your name because of it. Marisol grinned, unrepentant. The way she always did right, before saying something designed to needle me. "Sweet, was it? That's what he called you. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It's never exactly a compliment with men like that. That's how you know it's going to become one." I threw a dish towel at her, and she caught it laughing, and for a while we just worked in companionable quiet. The way we had for over a decade, her stealing bits of whatever I was making, me pretending to mind. It was the kind of ordinary morning I'd built my whole adult life around protecting. Small, mine, untouched by anyone who hadn't earned the right to be in it. "You're thinking about the wedding," Marisol said eventually, not a question. "I'm thinking about the cake." "There's a difference. There is absolutely not a difference, and you know it." She hopped off the counter, wiping sugar from her fingers onto her jeans with the casual disregard she'd always had for anything that wasn't actively on fire. "You haven't talked about your own almost wedding in 2 years, Alina. Not once. And then a stranger eats a tartlet in front of you, and suddenly you're telling me about the 2 lean years like it's just a fact about the weather." She wasn't wrong. And I didn't love that she wasn't wrong. There was something about the stillness in that ballroom, the particular quality of attention Rafael Mendoza had turned on me. That had loosened something I usually kept tied down tight enough not to notice the knot. "I don't know anything about him," I said. "Not really. I know he's frightening to the right people and apparently generous to bakers who get laughed at. That's not exactly a character reference. No, Marisol agreed. But it's not nothing either. I didn't have an answer for that, so I went back to my candied peel, and the morning carried on the ordinary way mornings did in that kitchen, small, quiet. Entirely mine, right up until the courier knocked 3 days later with cream paper and a stranger's careful handwriting. And the ordinary stopped being something I could fully count on anymore. The commission came through a courier instead of a phone call, which should have told me something about the kind of man I was dealing with before I ever read a word of it. A single sheet, heavy cream paper, his handwriting. I would learn later it was his handwriting, not an assistant's, which apparently meant something in his world, requesting a private tasting. No wedding this time. No event at all, just a name, an address in the hills above the city, and a time. I almost said no. I want that on the record, the way I keep most things on the record with myself these days. I stood in my kitchen with that cream paper in my sugar-stained hands and almost said no. Because every instinct I had, the ones that had carried me safely through a broken engagement and 2 lean years and 100 small humiliations at other people's weddings, told me that a man like that did not request private tastings from bakers he found charming. He requested things from people he intended to use. I said yes anyway. I have never claimed to be smarter than my own curiosity. The house above the city was not what I expected, not gaudy, not the loud architecture of new money trying to announce itself. Quiet stone, old olive trees, a kitchen larger than my entire apartment that he led me into himself, sleeves rolled, no jacket, none of the suited men I'd half expected trailing behind him. "You cook here yourself?" I asked, because the kitchen had the worn, used look of a room someone actually lived in, not the showroom gloss of money performing domesticity. Sometimes. Badly, something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. My mother taught me 3 dishes before she died. I've ruined all 3 at some point. I keep trying anyway. It was the first real thing he'd told me, offered without my asking for it, and I understood even then. That men like Rafael Mendoza Solis did not hand out real things carelessly. We talked for 2 hours that should have been 20 minutes. He asked about my training, self-taught, mostly, a few brutal years under a pastry chef in Toledo who broke more of my confidence than my technique, ironically improving both. I asked, carefully, about the ports, the territory Marisol had warned me ran half the coast, and watched him answer in the careful, edged way of a man accustomed to giving away exactly as much truth as kept a conversation moving without ever opening a door he hadn't chosen to open. "There are people who would very much like what I have," he said, when I pushed slightly on why his house sat behind gates and old stone walls thick enough to be defensive rather than decorative. "I've spent 11 years making sure they don't get it. It isn't glamorous. It's mostly patience and being right more often than the men trying to take it from me. That sounds lonely." He looked at me for a long moment, the same assessing look from the ballroom. Except warmer now, less a test and more an actual question he was turning over. "It is," he said simply, no flourish in it, no self-pity either. I hadn't thought about it in exactly those words before. He commissioned a dessert that day, not for an event, he insisted, just for himself, an open request with almost no parameters, which terrified me more than any specific brief ever had. "Build me something that tells me who you are," he said, and I understood, walking back down the hill to my car with that absurd, enormous assignment sitting in my chest like a stone, that I had just been asked a question far larger than cake. Somewhere behind those old stone walls, in a room I hadn't been shown, a framed photograph sat facing the wall instead of out into the room, a detail I wouldn't learn about or understand the weight of for several more weeks. But I felt its absence even then, the way you feel a held breath in a house before anyone tells you why. I asked him before I left why a man with a kitchen that size didn't simply hire a private chef to use it properly. "I did once," he said. "She quit. Said the house made her uneasy, too quiet," she said, "in the wrong places." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, though I noted the careful way he'd answered. The same edged honesty he'd used about the ports, true, but bounded. A door opened only as far as he intended. Driving back down toward the city, the commission sitting heavy in my chest, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in 2 years. Thinking seriously about what a wedding cake actually needed to say, rather than simply how to build one that wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Build me something that tells me who you are. It was, I realized, the exact question I used to ask myself about my own cake, back when I still let myself imagine I'd get to eat a slice of it. I didn't tell Raphael that. I didn't tell anyone. But I drove home already half composing the dessert in my head, layer by layer, the way you compose something you intend to mean. I delivered the dessert myself, 11 days later, because some things you don't trust to a courier, no matter how careful his handwriting is. It was a small thing, in the end, not a cake, not anything that needed 6 tiers or a team to carry it. A single tart, orange blossom and burnt sugar, the same combination that had been on my hands the night of the gala, built small enough to mean something instead of impress anyone. I'd spent 11 days deciding what would tell a near stranger who I was, and landed, finally, on the truth. Something delicate that had clearly survived being scorched. He met me at the gate himself again, no jacket, sleeves already rolled like he'd been expecting to work with his hands at some point in the day regardless of who arrived. "You came yourself," he said, taking the box from me with both hands, careful in a way that had nothing to do with the box's fragility and everything to do with something else I couldn't name yet. "I don't let couriers carry the things that matter." Something flickered across his face at that, quick, there and gone, the same flicker I'd catalogued at the gala without understanding it. He set the box down on the long stone table in the courtyard instead of carrying it inside, and that was the first thing that told me something was wrong. The way you know a room's temperature has changed before you've consciously registered why. "Raphael, give me a moment." His voice had gone somewhere else entirely, still controlled, but the control had a cost to it now, visible in the line of his jaw. The stillness of his hands, where a moment ago they'd been careful and warm. He opened the box slowly, looked at the tart inside it. And I watched a man who ran half the ports on that coast go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with grief he hadn't planned on meeting in a pastry box. "Talk to me," I said, because the silence had gone on a beat too long. And because some instinct in me, the same one that had kept my hands steady through the laughter at the gala, told me this silence was not for me to fill with reassurance. It was for him to fill, in his own time, or not at all. "My sister loved orange blossom," he said finally, and his voice had a roughness in it I hadn't heard before, not even when discussing the men trying to take his ports. "She used to put it in everything, tea, perfume, she would have," he stopped, started again, slower. "She would have liked this very much." Would have. He didn't answer that directly. Instead his hand came up, not toward the tart, toward me, fingers brushing my wrist where a thin white scar still marked the spot I'd burned myself on a tray 3 weeks earlier. An old, faded thing most people never noticed. He noticed. "You burn yourself a great deal for someone this careful," he said, and the deflection was so clean, so practiced, that I understood immediately he'd done this before, turned a hard question into an easier one, redirected grief into observation. A man defending the only kind of control he had left. "Sugar work asks a lot of your hands. You learn to live with the marks. I know something about that." His thumb moved once lightly over the old scar, and the gesture had nothing to do with sugar or burns at all anymore. "Living with the marks." We stood there a moment too long, his hand still at my wrist, the tart sitting open and untouched between us. And I understood, the way you understand weather changing before the first drop of rain actually lands, that whatever question I'd asked by accident about his sister had just answered the larger one. I hadn't known to ask at all. Why a man like Rafael Mendoza Solis had stood up, in front of 200 strangers, to defend a baker he'd never met. It wasn't gallantry. Marisol had been wrong about that detail, but right about the shape of the thing underneath it. He pulled his hand back first, the careful control sliding back over his face like a door closing gently instead of slamming. "Thank you for the tart," he said, formal again, the warmth banked but not gone. "I'll have payments sent to your account by morning. You don't have to, I know I don't have to." He looked at me. And something in the look told me the conversation about his sister was over for today, but not over for good. The way a door left unlocked is different from a door left open. "I want to." I drove home with the empty pastry box on my passenger seat and the specific, unshakable certainty that I had just touched something in that house far larger and far more fragile than any cake I'd ever built, and that whatever it wasn't finished with either of us yet. Marisol noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself, which was, infuriatingly, exactly her function in my life. "You've gone quiet about him," she said, 2 weeks after the tart, watching me build a 6-layer test cake in my kitchen for no client at all. Simply because my hands had wanted something to do, and my mind had wanted somewhere to put a feeling I hadn't named yet. That's worse than when you wouldn't stop talking about him. Quiet means it's real. It's not anything yet. "Alina." She said my name the way she always did when she intended to be taken seriously despite her usual lightness. "You're building a cake nobody ordered." I didn't have a defense for that, so I kept piping, the way I always did when a conversation got somewhere I wasn't ready for it to go. Raphael had called twice since the tart, not commissions, just conversation. The kind that started with logistics and ended an hour later with neither of us quite sure how we'd gotten from delivery schedules to his memories of his mother's 3 ruined dishes. My memories of the broken engagement I still didn't discuss with most people. He hadn't mentioned his sister again. I hadn't pushed. We had both, apparently, decided that some doors got reopened slowly or not at all. "I build the centerpiece last," I told him, the 3rd time he called, somehow already mid-conversation about how I actually worked rather than what I actually made. "Everyone assumes you start with the big dramatic piece, the showstopper. You don't. You build everything steady first, the things that hold the whole thing up, and only once that's solid do you let yourself build the part that's allowed to be beautiful. If you build the beautiful part first, you spend the whole time terrified of breaking it before the foundation's even there to protect it." There was a silence on the line that went on a beat too long. The same kind of silence I now recognized from the courtyard, from the pastry box. "That's exactly what she planned to do," he said very quietly. "Who?" "Sophia." "My sister." The name landed in the conversation like the tart had landed in that box. A small, devastating fact, finally given its proper weight. She had the whole order written out for her own cake years before there was ever a wedding to put it on. Foundation first. The dramatic tier last, once everything underneath it could hold the weight. His voice had gone rough again, the same roughness from the courtyard. "She used to say it almost exactly the way you just did. Build what holds everything up. Then let yourself have the beautiful part." I sat with that, in my kitchen, piping hand gone still for the first time in the whole conversation. Understanding with a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature that I had just described, almost word for word. A plan made by a woman I had never met, for a wedding I now understood. With growing certainty, had never happened. "Raphael, what happened to her?" The silence this time was different, not deflection, not a door closing. A door deciding slowly, painfully, whether it was ready to open. "Not over the phone," he said finally. "Will you come to the house, tomorrow? I think I'm finally ready to tell you the part I haven't told anyone." I said yes, before I'd fully thought through what saying yes would cost either of us, the way I'd said yes to the Gala job. The way I'd said yes to the private tasting, the way I seemed, apparently, to keep saying yes to this man and the careful, wounded architecture of his life. I didn't sleep well that night. Some part of me already knew, the way you know a storm is close by the particular stillness of the air before it breaks. That whatever Raphael was about to tell me would not be the kind of thing either of us could simply set down again once it was said. I never made it to the house the next day. The car taking me there was run off the coastal road instead, deliberately, by 2 vehicles I didn't see until they were already boxing mine against the guardrail. I remember the impact more than the men. I remember my hands instinctively bracing the way you brace for a fall in a kitchen, some animal reflex that has nothing to do with logic. I remember a stranger's hand at the window before I'd even fully registered the car had stopped moving, and I remember, with a clarity that still sometimes wakes me at night, understanding that the men outside the car were not there for my purse. "Get the baker," one of them said to the other, and the word baker, said like a target instead of a profession, told me everything about how far this had already traveled beyond me. What I did not know, in that moment, trapped and frightened and furious in equal measure, was that Raphael was already 3 minutes behind me on the same road, having left the house early to meet me halfway, and that those 3 minutes were the only reason what happened next ended the way it did, instead of far worse. I have never, before or since, seen a man arrive at violence the way Raphael arrived that afternoon. Not the controlled, careful man from the gala, not the grieving one from the courtyard. But something underneath both of those versions of him that I understood, watching it happen. He had spent years keeping leashed for exactly this kind of reason. He was not loud. That was the part that frightened me most. He simply moved through the two men at my window with a totality that left no question, afterward, about who had won or how completely. "You're not hurt," he said, hands on my face the second the car door was open, the same careful, assessing touch from our very first meeting at the gala, except now it was shaking just slightly. In a way, his hands had never done before in front of me. "I'm fine. Raphael, your hands are not the concern right now." He pulled me out of the car and against him in one motion, and I felt, for the first time since I'd met him, the full weight of how much control this man spent every single day maintaining. And how close that control had just come to breaking entirely on a coastal road over a woman he'd known for barely a month. Who were they? Domings's men. The name came out flat, final, a door slamming on a name he clearly intended to make pay for this. He's wanted my ports for 2 years. He's never once gone after anyone close to me before. His hand moved to the side of my face, thumb resting just below the small fresh scrape from the impact. And something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not even fully fear, but a dawning, terrible understanding. "Which means he already knows you're close enough to matter. Am I close enough to matter?" He looked at me for a long moment, on a road still scattered with 2 unconscious men and the wreckage of my car, and I watched him decide, finally, to stop deflecting the question the way he deflected the question about his sister in the courtyard. "Sophia died at her own wedding," he said, the words coming out raw and sudden, like something finally given permission to surface after years underwater. "A bomb meant for me, planted by a man who wanted my territory and didn't care whose wedding he had to destroy to take it. I have not been able to look at a wedding cake without going still since the day I watched hers burn on the ground instead of being cut." His thumb pressed, just slightly, against my jaw. "And today, on this road, the only thought in my head the entire drive was not her too, not gratitude, not obligation. Just that, he kissed me there, on a road still smelling of burnt rubber and adrenaline, slow and certain despite everything around us. The kind of kiss a man gives when he has finally run out of reasons to keep calling something else by its name. "Dulce," he said against my mouth, and for the first time since the gala, the word held nothing sharp in it at all. Behind us, sirens were already approaching, and somewhere past them, in an office that smelled like old paper and new threats, a man named Domings was about to learn exactly what kind of war he had just started by reaching for the wrong woman. Marisol paid the price 4 days later, and the fact that it wasn't me who paid it first made the guilt almost unbearable. She was leaving my kitchen after a late delivery run, doing me the simple favor she'd done 100 times before. When a car clipped hers deliberately at an intersection 2 blocks from my apartment, not enough to kill her, I understood later, but enough to send a message with exquisite precision. She came out of it with a broken wrist and a concussion and a fear in her eyes, when I reached the hospital, that I had never once seen on her face in 15 years of friendship. "I'm fine," she said, before I could even get the question out, the same reflexive deflection I'd used at the gala. "Elena, I'm fine. Stop looking at me like that. You're not fine. You're in a hospital bed because of me. You're being dramatic. But her hand, when I took it, was shaking, and we both knew the dramatics weren't mine. Raphael came to the hospital himself, which told the whole ward exactly who was responsible for the security detail suddenly posted outside Marisol's room, and stood in the hallway afterward, with a stillness that had gone past, controlled into something closer to grief. "This is what I told you the cost would look like," he said. "I told myself I'd find a way around it. I haven't found a way around it. Domings will keep reaching for the people near you until there's no one left close enough to hurt, and then he'll reach for you directly, and I am not certain, after today, that I can promise you I'll always be 3 minutes away. You're not asking me to leave. I'm asking you to understand what staying means. Before you decide." His voice had none of the Gala's warmth in it now, none of the courtyard's careful tenderness, just a flat, exhausted honesty. "I can move you somewhere he can't find you. New city, new name if it has to be that. I would not think less of you, Alina." I would understand completely. I thought about Marisol's shaking hand in mine. About the cake I'd built for no one, sitting half-eaten in my refrigerator at home. Evidence of a feeling I'd been too afraid to name out loud, until a stranger's hand had brushed an old scar on my wrist and made the fear feel almost beside the point. I thought about the engagement I'd walked away from years ago, not because of danger, but because the man in question had simply, quietly, stopped being someone I trusted to stand beside. And how different this felt. How this fear was sharp and immediate and entirely external, instead of the slow erosion of trust I'd lived through before. "If I leave," I said slowly, "I spend the rest of my life wondering whether I left out of wisdom or out of cowardice, and I won't actually know the difference because I'll never test it. If I stay, at least I'll know exactly which one I chose and why. That's not a small risk to take for clarity. No. But it's mine to take." I held his gaze the way I had at the gala, no flinch in it, no performance either. "I've spent 2 years building a life so careful, so small, that nothing in it could ever hurt me the way the wedding that fell apart hurt me. I called that wisdom too, for a long time. It wasn't wisdom, it was just a smaller kind of safe, and I'm done choosing smaller just because it's safer." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he took my hand, gently, the way he'd taken it at the gala over a stranger's tartlet, except now there was nothing left to assess, only something to hold. "Then we go to war with this together," he said. "And I need you to know, before you agree to that fully, I could not save Sophia. I have spent 6 years making sure no one else paid that price for standing near me, and today I learned that promise was never as solid as I needed it to be. I am only certain I will not stop trying until there's nothing left of me to try with." That night, for the first time, I heard him give an order over the phone in the hallway outside Marisol's room, calm, precise, terrible in its specificity, and understood, listening to it, that the war I had just chosen to stay inside of had, as of that moment, formally begun. They took me 3 days later, from my own kitchen. In the 11 minutes, the security detail had stepped outside to relieve themselves in a careful, staggered rotation that Domings's people had clearly studied longer than anyone realized. I fought. I want that on the record, the same way I want my steady hands at the gala on the record. I was not calm about it, not graceful. I fought until a cloth went over my mouth, and the kitchen I'd built my whole adult life around went soft and gray at the edges before it disappeared entirely. I woke in a room that smelled, absurdly, of old flour and damp concrete. A disused bakery, I would learn later, abandoned for years, chosen, I suspected, with a cruelty that wasn't accidental. My wrists were bound to a pipe along the wall with something that bit when I pulled, and I stopped pulling fairly fast, the way I'd learned, somewhere in my life before this one. That pain rarely earns you anything worth its cost. The man who came to look at me introduced himself, with an almost business-like courtesy, as working for Domings, though he never gave his own name. "This isn't about you," he said, not unkindly, which frightened me more than cruelty would have. "Mendoza needs to understand exactly how close we can get before he believes it. You're the proof of distance, then call him and prove it. You don't need me conscious for that. It works better with you conscious." He said it the way you'd state a recipe's chemistry, plain, unbothered, and I understood, hearing it. that I was dealing with a man for whom my fear was simply an ingredient, nothing personal in it at all. I did not break. I want to be careful about what that means, because I think people imagine, watching stories like this from the safety of not living inside one, that not breaking looks heroic. Looks like defiance you can see from across a room. It didn't, it looked like arithmetic. It looked like deciding, plainly, that giving this man my fear cost me something I might need later and gain me nothing now, and choosing, on that basis alone, not to spend it. I thought of my own hands instead, sugar-burned, scarred, never quite still, the hands that had kept piping cream onto a tartlet while a ballroom laughed at me. The hands Raphael's thumb had traced like something worth understanding instead of hiding. I thought that steadiness was never really about not feeling it. It was about refusing to let the feeling decide what I did next. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me even there, bound to a pipe in a room that smelled like someone else's failed bakery. Raphael asked me to choose this, eyes open, and I did. And this room is exactly what the cost was always going to look like. It was hours later, near what I guessed was midnight by the particular ache of stillness in my legs, that the businesslike man returned with new questions about Marisol. About my kitchen's supply schedule, about a name I didn't recognize at first, Tamaz. He's been delivering my flour for 3 years, I said, before the man could finish whatever he was building toward. He doesn't know anything about security details or Mendoza's routes. He knows how much semolina I need on Tuesdays, and you'd know that for certain. I order from him every week. I would know. It wasn't entirely confidence. It was the only currency I had left, and I spent it carefully. Watching the businesslike man's expression recalibrate against whatever he'd already been told, understanding, even. Bound to a pipe in a freezing room, that I had just protected someone the way Raphael had once stood up across an entire ballroom to protect me. The traitor's name, when it finally surfaced near 1 a.m. from the man's increasingly impatient questions, was not Tamaz at all. It was one of Raphael's own men, Esteban, someone Marisol had mentioned once in passing as having been with the family even longer than most. Someone trusted enough to be left alone with the security schedule that had supposedly kept me safe. The businesslike man said the name the way you'd say a password that finally worked, and the temperature of that ruined bakery seemed to drop by several more degrees. Because now I understood that whoever had told Domings's people the exact 11 minutes I would be unguarded had done so from inside the walls that were supposed to be protecting me. Not outside them. I was still turning that knowledge over. What else has Esteban already given away? Does Raphael even know yet? Is he walking into something he doesn't see coming? When the door at the far end of that abandoned bakery exploded inward, and I understood, before I even heard his voice, that the man arriving for me had got close enough to almost too late that it might not matter, yet, which side of that line we actually landed on. There is a version of me that existed before her, patient, controlled, willing to wait years to be right instead of fast, and I felt that version of myself end somewhere on the drive to the address Esteban finally, weeping. Gave up under questioning, he will spend the rest of his short, watched life regretting. I do not remember the drive itself. I remember the smell of old flour through a broken door, and I remember that my hands did not shake until afterward, once she was actually in front of me, alive, breathing. Furious in the particular way that told me immediately she had not broken, and only then did 6 years of careful control simply stop existing all at once. The way a dam does not crack slowly, but goes, entirely, in a single moment. I heard him before I saw him, not his voice exactly, but the specific quality of silence that fell over the businesslike man's face the instant the door gave way. The silence of someone recalculating, far too late, exactly how much danger he had actually walked himself into. Raphael didn't say anything when he found me. He crossed the ruined bakery floor, cut the binding at my wrists with a blade I hadn't seen him draw, and pulled me against him hard enough that, for a moment, neither of us could breathe properly. And neither of us minded at all. "I'm here," I said into his chest, because he seemed to need the words more than I needed to say anything else. "I'm here, I'm fine, I didn't break, I didn't tell them anything that mattered. I know. His voice came out wrecked, nothing at all like the still water I'd first met across a wedding ballroom. I know, Dulce. You protected Tamaz before I even got the call about where you were. You protected my people from inside a room you should never have been in. Behind him, the businesslike man had already been disarmed by two of Raphael's own, kneeling now. His earlier careful courtesy entirely gone, replaced with something closer to honest terror. What happened next is not something I watched directly. Raphael turned me, physically, his hand at the back of my head, the exact gesture a person uses to keep someone from seeing something that will live behind their eyes forever if they do. I am grateful for that turning, even now. I understood, in the sounds that followed, everything I needed to about what kind of man had been holding me a moment earlier with such aching gentleness, and I understood, too, that both versions of him were the same man, and that I had chosen him anyway, eyes open, exactly as I'd promised in a hospital hallway 4 days earlier. It was Marisol, wrist still in a cast, arriving with the second wave of Raphael's men because she had refused, point blank, to stay behind, who found us afterward and folded me into a hug so fierce it nearly matched his. "You absolute idiot," she said into my hair, voice cracking with something that wasn't entirely relief. "You went and got kidnapped over flower deliveries. You got hit by a car over my flower deliveries, Marisol. I'm not the idiot in this friendship. We're both idiots. It's why it works." She pulled back, managed something close to her usual grin despite the cast and the exhaustion etched into her face, and looked between me and Raphael with an expression that, even in the wreckage of that bakery, found room for warmth. "Tamaz is going to want a raise when he hears how loyal you were to his flower schedule, you know." Even Raphael, blood-marked and hollowed out, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Esteban's betrayal, once fully unwound over the following hours, told a story uglier and simpler than I'd feared, not loyalty to Domings, not even real conviction. Just debts owed to the wrong people for the wrong reasons, paid off slowly in fragments of schedule information that had each, on their own, seemed too small to matter. The 11 minutes outside my kitchen, the rotation gap in the detail, a version of trust hollowed out so gradually that no one, not even Raphael, had felt it going until it was already gone. "Domings will know we have Esteban," Raphael said, much later, once a doctor brought in through a back entrance had finished checking me over. Once the adrenaline had finally begun receding enough to let exhaustion in behind it. "He'll know his information is dead, and that means he'll know his patience has run out of time. He'll come himself, not men he can afford to lose. Himself, then we're ready. We are not ready." His hand found mine, held it the way it had at the gala, except now there was nothing left to assess that he didn't already know completely. "We are about to find out, very soon, whether 6 years of preparation was enough. I have never not known the answer to a question like this before, Dulce. I find I dislike it considerably, outside. Somewhere past the ruined bakery and the flour dust, and the careful architecture of a man who had spent 6 years promising himself no one else would pay for standing near him. A war 2 years in the making was, finally, about to stop waiting. Domings came on a Sunday, 11 days after the bakery, and he came exactly the way Raphael had predicted himself, in daylight, with enough men that the gesture itself was a message. I am no longer being careful about being seen. I was not meant to be anywhere near the port that day. I want to say that clearly, because what happened next was not recklessness on my part, not some attempt to prove anything. It was simple bad timing. A delivery of supplies for a commission I'd insisted on collecting myself, because the business that had once been entirely mine still mattered, even now. Even folded into a life this large and this dangerous. I saw the cars before anyone else did, because I was the only person at that loading dock not already braced for them. What followed I will describe only in the shape of it, because the details belong to the people who fought it, not to the woman who mostly stayed where Raphael's men put her and trusted. For once in my life, that someone else's competence was something I was allowed to rely on. I will say that Marisol, cast and all, drove a delivery van through a barricade with a steadiness that suggested 15 years of friendship with me, had taught her more about handling pressure than either of us had ever realized. I will say that Tamaz, of all people, fought off two men with nothing but a flower delivery dolly and a fury that surprised even him afterward. I will say that Raphael and Domings found each other near the end of it, on a stretch of dock slick with rain that had started without anyone noticing. And that whatever passed between them was not a monologue, was not an explanation of grievances. It was simply the ending of a thing that had been building toward an ending since before I'd ever piped a single rosette of cream at a wedding gala. Domings did not survive the docks. Neither did one of Raphael's longest-serving men, a quiet, careful man named Bautista, who had once helped me carry the 6-deer cake into the Hidalgo Vasquez ballroom without my ever learning his name, and whose absence afterward would leave an actual room in Raphael's house emptier than it had been before. Raphael was not the same man who walked away from that dock as the one who'd walked onto it. I noticed it instantly. The way you notice whether changing in a room you've spent enough time in to know its usual temperature. Something in him had gone quiet in a different register than his usual stillness. Something that wasn't peace, not yet, but wasn't the held breath of grief either. It was the silence of a debt finally, fully paid, at a cost too large to call victory cleanly. "It's over," he told me, much later, his hands not quite steady around mine the way they'd been steady around everything else all day. 2 years. "It's actually over. At what it cost." Yes. He didn't pretend otherwise, didn't offer me a clean ending the way stories like this one always seem to promise from a safe distance. Always at what it cost. I don't think I understood before you that the cost was the only part of this that was ever guaranteed. We buried Bautista 3 days later, and I stood beside Raphael through the service. And understood, watching him grip his oldest lieutenant's hand at the graveside with a tenderness I'd never seen him offer anyone but me before. That grief had stopped being a locked room in his life. It had become, simply, something he let people stand inside with him. The house above the city took longer to settle than the bodies did. For nearly a week after the docks, the men who guarded it still moved through its halls at the same wary pace they'd kept for 2 years. As though the war might rise back up out of the stone if they relaxed too soon. I caught myself, more than once, listening for a sound that no longer had any reason to come. It was Marisol, predictably, who broke the spell first, arriving at the house with her cast finally off and a cake, store-bought, deliberately terrible. An offense to everything I'd ever taught her, and announcing to anyone within earshot that she intended to keep being alive and ridiculous for as long as possible, war or no war. Raphael ate a slice without complaint, and I watched the house exhale fully, all at once, like something that had finally remembered it was allowed to. The house took its time rebuilding, not the stone walls, those had never been touched, but the held breath I'd noticed the very first day I walked through its gates. The one that had lived in every quiet corner long before I'd ever arrived. It was Raphael who finally told me the rest of Sophia's story, on a night neither of us had planned for it. Sitting in the courtyard, where I'd first delivered the tart that had cracked his careful control wide open. "She was 26, he said, plainly, the way I'd once told him the plain truth about my own broken engagement. The wedding was small, by our family's standards. She wanted it that way, said anything bigger would just be performing happiness instead of having it. Domings's men planted the device under the cake table because they knew it was the one place I'd be standing, toasting her, when the schedule said the cutting would happen. His hand in mine. Didn't shake, though I understood the cost of that steadiness, now far better than I had at the start. I was 3 minutes late to my own toast. Sophia wasn't. I have spent 6 years telling myself that if I had simply been on time, it would have been me instead of her. And some days that thought is the only thing that gets me through the morning. And then I built you a tart with the same flowers in it. And then you built me a tart with the same flowers in it. Something that was almost a laugh. Almost caught in his throat instead. I couldn't go near a wedding cake for 6 years. I went to the Hidalgo Vasquez wedding, because skipping it would have raised more questions than attending. And I was prepared to spend the whole night standing as far from the dessert table as politeness allowed. And then, a woman the room was laughing at didn't flinch, and didn't perform anything for anyone. And I found myself crossing the room before I'd even decided to. I'm still sorry about your sister. Don't be sorry. Be here. He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since the gala, I watched the last of his careful control simply set itself down, gently like something he no longer needed to carry alone. You didn't just survive what this cost you, Alina. You walked toward it on purpose twice, when leaving would have been so much easier and so much safer. I have spent 6 years protecting everyone near me by keeping them at a careful distance, and you walked through that distance in 11 minutes flat. The same way you walked through a ballroom full of people laughing at you, and proved to me that the distance had never actually been protecting anyone. It had just been keeping me alone. He didn't kneel. I want to say that because it would have been the easy ending. The fairy tale shape my mother would have wanted if she were still alive to want anything from this story. But Raphael had never once given me an easy version of anything, and he didn't start now. He simply took my hand, turned it palm up, and pressed something small and warm into it. A ring, plain, with a faint pattern worked deliberately into the band, the shape. I realized with my breath catching, of an orange blossom. I had it made from a piece of Sophia's wedding band, he said. She never got to wear it long enough to wear it out. I know that should probably feel morbid. I've been told that by Marisol extensively and at considerable length. And without my asking, it doesn't feel morbid. No, it feels like building the foundation first. I closed my hand around it, around him. Around 2 years of careful distance, I'd once mistaken for safety, and a man who had mistaken control for the only kind of protection he had left to offer anyone. I know exactly what staying with you costs. I knew it on the coastal road, and I knew it in that bakery, and I know it right now, sitting in this courtyard. I'm choosing it anyway. Eyes open, that's not a yes. It's better than a yes. I slid the ring onto my own finger before he could, which made him laugh, actually laugh, open and surprised. A sound I would spend the rest of my life trying to earn again and again. It's a dulce, Raphael. Sweet things don't ask permission to be sweet. They simply are, and you build everything else around them. And eventually, you stop calling it risk and start calling it the only part of the cake worth building at all. He kissed me in the courtyard where this had truly started, under a sky that, for once in the whole length of this story, was simply, ordinarily clear. 10 months later, I dropped a cake. It wasn't a 6-year showstopper this time, just a simple sponge, practice for a Tuesday, the kind of object no one in their right mind would mourn. It hit the floor of the kitchen in the house above the city, the one Raphael had rebuilt around me, room by room, until it stopped feeling like a fortress and started feeling like somewhere we actually lived, and it splattered into a mess sticky enough that sweeping seemed like the only sensible first response. Raphael came around the corner at the sound, the way he always did now. Not with the controlled stillness of a man assessing a threat, but with the easy half-alarm of a husband checking that his wife hadn't burned herself on something stupid. "It's just a sponge," I said, already reaching for a towel, already crouching down the exact way I had at a wedding ballroom 10 months and one whole lifetime ago. "I know." He crouched across from me anyway, close enough that I could smell coffee instead of cigars over something colder. And something in my chest went warm and a little undone at the deliberate echo of it. "I just like watching how you handle it now. How did I used to handle it? At the gala, you didn't even look up. You kept your hands moving like the room wasn't there at all, like asking anyone to notice you'd been hurt was a debt you couldn't afford to take on." He picked up a piece of broken sponge. Set it gently into the bowl I held. "Now you just say I dropped something and you let me kneel down next to you while you laugh about it. It costs you nothing now. It used to cost you everything to even admit a mistake out loud. I hadn't noticed I'd changed. That's the strange mathematics of being truly seen, I think. You rarely catch the moment the shame stops sitting where it used to sit. You only notice, much later, that the old joke doesn't sting in the quiet anymore." I caught myself humming while I wiped down the counter. Off-key, the same tuneless thing I'd apparently been doing since long before the gala, according to Raphael, who claimed he'd first noticed it standing near my dessert table that night, and had stood there a beat longer than strictly necessary, just to keep listening over the band. I hadn't known then that anyone could hear it over the noise of 200 strangers. I knew now, and I let it carry on anyway. Marisol's wrist had healed into nothing more than a faint ache when it rained, and she ran half my kitchen now. Officially, on a payroll Raphael had insisted on setting up the week after the bakery, calling it the smallest possible repayment for a debt he refused to ever call settled. Tamaz delivered flour twice a week still, and told the story of fighting off 2 armed men with a delivery dolly to anyone who'd hold still long enough to listen. The exaggeration growing by roughly 1 additional attacker every few months. Esteban's name was never spoken in Raphael's house again, by anyone, for any reason, and I understood that as its own kind of mercy, the only one the situation had been able to afford. The framed photograph that had once faced the wall in Raphael's study now faced out into the room instead, Sophia, laughing at something out of frame. Taken the year before the wedding that never finished happening. Raphael had turned it around himself, the week after the docks, and told me only that some empty spaces deserved to be filled with something that could survive being looked at again. Dulce, Raphael said, that evening, watching me from the kitchen doorway the exact way he'd watched me from across a ballroom 10 months earlier. Except nothing about the way he said it now carried even a trace of its original edge. 10 months had worn every sharp thing off the word, and left only the warm bones of it standing. What? Nothing. He crossed the kitchen, the way he always crossed rooms now, like there was nowhere else worth being. I just like saying it. I like that it used to mean the woman they laughed at, and now it just means you. I thought of the ring made from his sister's wedding band, still warm on my finger. I thought of a man who had built 6 years of careful distance out of grief, and then let a stranger's steady hands at a dessert table crack the whole careful structure open. I thought of my own hands, sugar-scarred, never quite still, and understood, finally, fully, that I had not survived the gala by refusing to feel the laughter. I had survived it by refusing to let the feeling decide what my hands did next, and that this, not numbness, not smallness, had been the actual skill all along. Some things, once mocked, you rebuild so carefully that the rebuilding becomes the strongest part of the structure. Some people, once truly seen, never go back to hiding the way they did before. They simply learn, slowly, in someone else's kitchen, what it costs to let another person watch you work. And that the cost, paid honestly, is the only kind of sweetness worth having. I am not the woman who walked into that ballroom with a 6-tier cake and a stranger's cruelty waiting for her at the head table. I do not think I would recognize her anymore, not fully, and I find, wiping the last of a ruined sponge cake off a kitchen counter that has never once needed to hold its breath, that I do not miss her very much at all. A question before you go. Bautista carried a stranger's wedding cake into a ballroom without ever asking for thanks, and died years later, still standing close enough to Raphael to pay the final price for it. Raphael spent 6 years keeping everyone he loved at a careful distance, certain that distance was the only kind of protection he had left to offer, and it took a woman who refused to flinch at a dessert table to prove him wrong. If you had to choose between Bautista's quiet, costly loyalty and Raphael's slow, guarded rebuilding, which one do you think actually protects the people we love, standing close no matter the risk? Or keeping distance to spare them the danger of us at all? Tell me in the comments. I would really like to know which one you would have been.